Hello and welcome everybody to this Hibernate course. In this course, you're going to learn everything that you will need to work with one of the most powerful and important frameworks in the Java universe. For the start of the course, let's briefly explain what actually is Hibernate and what is its purpose. Now, Hibernate is a so-called object relational mapping framework. But what does that mean? If we think about a very simple system that only contains of some sort of Java backend and a relational database, we can see that while on the Java side we could represent a person entity by something like this, it could look on the database side something like this. And now the question is, how can we communicate with the database? Well, in a lot of cases, we will use some kind of query language, like for example, SQL. And to get, to read, update, create or delete entities on a database, we would have to write a lot of SQL statements. Now, for the person entity, for example, a SQL statement that we write and send to the database and then get back our person entity could look something like this. At first, we would need to write the SQL statement, and then we would have to prepare the statement, injecting some parameters. Afterwards, we would execute the query on the database, and once the result set, whatever that is, comes back, we would need to iterate over it and map one by one the attributes from the result set into a person object and then return the person object at the end of this method. Now, you can already see that for a very simple, uh, it's a very simple class like this person, very few attributes. This is already a lot of code. And if we imagine that we would have to write all these select statements for an enterprise Java application with a lot of objects, not only select statement, but also update, delete, create statements, we can already see that this would be a huge problem because we would need to maintain all these select statements. We would need to write them, we would need to maintain them, and we don't want to do that. Now, this is where Hibernate comes into play. By writing our person entity, something like this on the Java side, we can see that we used some annotations over the attributes. This whole select statement would be converted into just a single line of code. And this is where the importance of Hibernate lies. This is why it's so powerful and so widely used, because it really helps us with the communication between a Java system and a persistence unit. Yeah. And while it's called an object relational mapping framework, it does not only map objects from the Java world to the persistence units and back again. It does more stuff. And while it's also really easy to set up, it can become quite complex over the time. And so you have everything that you need to work with this framework. I made this course. And yeah, that's about it for the introduction. Let's just start right into coding with the project setup. So let's start with the project setup. The project setup is really easy. We are going to use the Spring initializer. Just Google for Spring initializer and it will lead you directly to this page. And our project will be built with Maven. Language is Java. We will use SpringBoot 3.4.0 and Java 23. So the dependencies that we are going to need are very few. At first, we will need a Spring Web, so we can just build simple endpoints. The second thing we're going to need is Spring JPA. Spring JPA, you can already see it here, uses Hibernate, so that is where Hibernate is inside. And we also need the H2 database dependency. With this dependency, we can just set up a database really easy. That's all. You can give it a name if you want to your project, but then that's your choice, and we can generate the project, get the zip, and just import it to our favorite IDE. Okay, so after downloading the zip and importing it to your favorite IDE, we are going to start coding. And I choose the IntelliJ IDE because it's my favorite IDE. And first of all, we are going to look into our pom.xml, where we can find all the dependencies that we just added to our project in the Spring Initializer. On the one hand, we have Spring Boot Starter JPA, we have Spring Boot Starter Web, and we have the H2 database. And if we take a look into the Spring Boot Starter JPA dependency, we can see over here that this is actually the dependency where we get Hibernate into the project. Okay, um, I already prepared some stuff for the course in this project, and I'm just going to go over it, just so you don't see me typing all the time and have more focus on explaining things than on writing code. And on the one hand, I already prepared a little data model, um, which, yeah, we were going to use. The application will take place in some sort of car rental service. And I also prepared a little um, REST controller class where we later will use which we will use to trigger CRUD operations on the database. And also I prepared some properties in the application properties, which are very important. And if you are following the course, you can just pause the video and copy these application properties. I'm going to go over them quickly. On the one hand, we have four um, properties that are relevant for our connection to the database. So we need to define these properties to connect to our database. Um, we use this connection URL to connect to the H2 database. The data is going to be saved in a file, and the file is going to be at the project root inside the data folder. Also, we need to define a driver class. We will need to define some username and some password to connect to the database. And we also need to define the dialect that we're going to use, because depending on which data source you're going to connect to your Java backend, there are different dialects that Hibernate needs to consider. For example, some SQL statements look different on an H2 database and on an Oracle database. And Hibernate also solves this problem just with this one configuration parameter, also a reason to use this framework. Then we have a little commented out string here, which is just the connection URL to the H2 console. We can open this URL in the browser, and then we can have a little graphical user interface so we can just see what is inside the database. And we need this setting to enable the console. Now, the last parameter is the DDL auto create drop. That means that every time we start our application, a new scheme is going to be created on the H2 database, and every time we stop our application, that the scheme is going to get dropped. This is something that, yeah, very probably you don't want to use in a production environment because you don't want to create and drop the scheme every time, but it's very handy for development purposes. There are also two more parameters that are commented out. We will use them later. They are very good for debugging and showing the actual SQL that Hibernate will create on the database. And to make this create drop property work, I also needed to add something in our application main class, which is this pre-destroy method. This will basically just close the Hibernate session whenever we stop the server, and this is what actually is going to uh, drop the scheme. Don't worry too much about this. We will talk about the entity manager um, later on. And yeah, that's about it. That is the project setup. We have our POM, we have our dependencies, we have our application properties, and we have a little data model and a CRUD controller. Yeah, so now the first thing we're going to do is just to start the application, and we are going to use this URL to connect to our database and just see how it looks like now. I just opened the URL in this browser, and I'm going to put in the connection parameter, and we can see that we have a connection to the database, but we have no tables inside it. And the first thing that we want to do now is we want to use this data model over here, and we want that every time we start up our application, Hibernate creates a scheme in the database that is according to the model that we have defined in our Java world. So what we're going to do is we are going to go to our customer entity, which looks something like this. It has an ID, first name, last name, email, and some local date, date of birth. And we want that this customer entity gets its own table in our database now. And this is very easy. We just need to add two annotations, three annotations. We will need to add the entity annotation. And this annotation, what it does, it tells Hibernate that this entity is somehow relevant to Hibernate. It should consider this entity, and we can already see that now our IDE is complaining, and it says persistent entity customer should always have primary key. This is because when we want to save, no matter what, but if we want to save a object on a database, it needs to have a primary key. And so to set that up, we can use the add ID annotation on top of this ID attribute, and that's already is. We have one more parameter that we're going to use, and this is the generated value annotation. What this basically means is that we, on the Java side, don't want to assign any value to this ID attribute. We say, or we let the database decide which ID this customer object is going to get. And that's already it. Now we're going to start the server again. And we are going to connect to our H2 database again. And now we can see that we already have the customer table in the H2 database just by using these few annotations. So this was the last time I have used the H2 console with the browser for now. I will switch now to the view over here in IntelliJ. It's a little bit easier. And I can also see the customer entity here. Okay, so we got our customer entity in the database, but obviously the table is empty. We don't have any customers in our database yet. And we are going to change that now. We are going to go to our CRUD controller class. And yeah, just as the name says, CRUD, create, read, update, and delete. And we are going to implement these methods for our customer entity. And for that, we will need, yeah, maybe the most important class in the whole Hibernate universe, which is called Entity Manager. We need to define the Entity Manager on top. We can make it private final, and then use constructor injection to get the entity manager into our class. And SpringBoot is now going, or Spring is now going to inject the entity manager into our CRUD controller. Now, if you have seen already some other tutorials, you may be more familiar with a class called Session, which also exists. And there, I'm going to explain later the difference between the session and the entity manager object. For now, let's stick to the entity manager and use it to write our CRUD controller. Now, to start with the create method, this is very easy. So we just get some customer with our API, get some customer in the request body, and we just need to call the entity manager dot persist method. What this basically does is it's going to persist the customer object that comes over here to the database. And this is actually a void method, so we are just going to return our customer again. Yeah. Now, let's try this method out. We can use the HTTP client, which is just integrated right into IntelliJ. If you don't have that, you can also use Postman to map this or to generate the request. But at first, we need to restart our server because we did some changes to it. And yeah, let's define a customer for our application. Let's say our customer is going to be called Jürgen Klopp, who has this email and was born, I don't know when Jürgen Klopp was born. Let's say on the 1st of 1960. Okay. Now we have our endpoint, we have our object that we want to create in the database. And now it is very important that we do not assign an ID to this object, because we said in our custom entity, we said that the ID is going to be generated by our database. And the ID is a primitive type of long in this case, because we will never have null in this ID attribute. So we will just set it to 0. And yeah, we can just run the request, and we can see that the request was successful. And now we can switch to our database and reload it, customer, and we see that we got our customer on the database. Now, what would happen if we set the ID to 1? Or let's make 2, because we already have a customer with ID 1. And I'm going to call this again. Now we say, look at this, error, internal server error. And if we look into the log, it will complain. It will say something like this, with, yeah, not very obvious what this means. Detached entity path to persist, but this is basically because we assigned an ID, although we said before this ID is going to get generated. Okay, now let's put back the ID to 0. Let's make another customer. It's going to be Pep Guardiola, and yeah, born on the same date. And now we can see that the request was successful. And what we can also see is that in the response, we already see the ID. Yeah, we return the customer object in the response. We persist the customer. It gets these parameters. It persists the customer on the database, and then it returns the customer. And in the entity that gets returned, we can see that the ID got assigned. And if we reload our database now, we can see 2 customers. Now let's dive a bit deeper into this, into the creating process by going back to our application properties and setting these two parameters to, or just commenting in these two parameters and restart the server. Because what I want to show you now is the actual SQL that Hibernate creates. Yeah, let us get one more customer who is going to be Carlo Ancelotti. Ancelotti with e.com, and we are going to execute the post request. And now if we look into the log, we can see the SQL statement that Hibernate created. So Hibernate created an insert statement, insert into customer the following values, and we can see that it does not show us exactly which values are inside, but yeah, we can see that it created a SQL statement. Nice. So this is really nice feature to just actually see what Hibernate is doing. Good. So the next thing we are going to do is, we also want to read the customers from our database after we created them. And for that, we are going to go back to our customer controller and we're going to implement the read method. To implement the read method, we just can call the entity manager.find method, and we only need to provide the class of the object that we're going to fetch from the database and the ID of the ID of the object, and that's already it. We can use our generator again. I already generated this endpoint, and we can restart the server. And once the server has started, we can take a little look at our database, and we will see that, because we restarted the server and we dropped and created the scheme again, we don't have any customers in our database. So we will create Carlo Ancelotti again, step by step. I accidentally executed the whole file. So we created Carlo Ancelotti 2 times. The second one has ID 2. We can look in our database. We can see that we have 2 customers, ID 1, ID 2. And now we can execute the read method. We can read the customer with ID 1, and we will get back our results. So we can see here the GET request has been executed, and we get our first customer, and we can also execute it for the ID 2, and we can see that we get our second customer. And if we would call it with the ID 3, we could see that the response body is empty because we don't have a customer with the ID 3. Okay, so now the next thing that we're going to do is we want to update a customer, and we can do that by using the entity manager dot merge method. We can use the merge method, and just like before, we are going to generate a request. We're going to restart the server, and just to be sure, we're going to check our database. We can see that it is empty. And now let's first create a customer. Has been created with the ID 1. Now let's read the customer. You can read it. And now let's modify or update our customer. And to update our customer, we need to provide the correct ID. So we know that we have a customer with the ID 1, and we are going to call him now Jürgen Klopp, and we're going to leave email and date of birth empty. And when we execute the statement, we can see that, we can firstly see that this was successful, but we can actually see it when we execute the read method again, and we can now see that the object that we get back actually has the values that we put in before. And we can also see this on the database where we have our customer now. Okay, what would happen if we set the ID to 0? Well, something interesting would happen because the merge method can create object and it can also update object. So if we provide an ID, it will update the object with the given ID. If we don't provide an ID, in this case 0 is not considered to be an ID, then it will create the object on the database. The only thing that we cannot do, what will result in an error, is if we provide an ID that does not exist. Because, just like before, we said the ID is going to be generated by the database. We provided an ID that does not exist. So Hibernate thinks, okay, I want to create the object, but then sees the ID has been provided. We don't want to do that. So this will result in an error. Okay, if we look into the log, we can also see the SQL statements that have been created by Hibernate. So let's take a look at them. Where does it start? So the first thing we did is we inserted the customer to our database. Then we selected a customer from our database. And finally, we updated the customer on our database. We can see all that here in the logs. Okay, now to implement the last method, we can just, the delete method, we can just call entity manager dot remove and, no, not refresh, remove. But to remove we can see that the remove method actually requires an object and not only an ID. So to remove the object, we need to call the entity manager.find method. So we need to find the object first and then remove it from the database. I'm going to restart the server again. And I'm going to generate a request. Where is our ID? Here. Okay, let us check the database. The database is empty. And we are going to create our customer. We can see that the database now is filled. And now we delete the customer. And we can see that the customer got deleted. So, in very little time, we implemented a whole CRUD controller for our customer entity, which can create customers, read customers, update and delete customers. And now, to wrap this whole thing up, I want to explain one more thing. You may have been wondering why we need to add the add transactional annotation on top of some of these methods. We need to add it to the create, update and delete method, but not to the read method. This has the following reason. Hibernate needs a database transaction to actually write stuff to the database. And on the create, update or delete, we write stuff to the database. With a read operation, we don't write stuff to the database, we just read it. So we don't need the add transactional annotation. What would happen if we forget this annotation? Let us try it out. I will restart the server. I will call the endpoint and I will get an error. And the error will say no entity manager with actual transaction available for current thread. That is what happens if we don't annotate the method with add transactional. Okay, so that's about it for this video. In the next video, we're going to dive deep into the data modeling. We're going to connect different classes. We're going to look at the difference between Hibernate and JPA. But for today, that's enough. I hope you liked the video. If so, I would really appreciate a like on the video. If you have questions or suggestions about this video, please leave everything in the comments. I will try to answer as many comments as possible. And yeah, see you next time.